Welcome to episode 120 of the Headspace and Timing podcast. Today, I have a discussion with Army veteran Kimberly Franco about suicide prevention and postvention.
I do think it's important to know what's available out there because we don't necessarily need everybody to be trainers or we don't need everybody that's doing housing. There's so many things. Just when we identify gaps, that's where you make the most impact.
Before we kick off the interview, I'd like to bring you a quick message from Dr. Barbara Van Dalen, founder and president of Give an Hour, about an event that's coming up June 9th through the 15th.
I'm Dr. Barbara Van Dalen, founder and president of Give an Hour and the Campaign to Change Direction. We want everyone to join us the second week of June for a Week to Change Direction and the Change Direction Jam. Together, we're changing the culture of mental health. Events during the week can happen anywhere and everywhere. We're so excited to work with IBM to create this global discussion. Mark your calendar, register, and join us to change direction. Go to changedirection.org. That's changedirection.org to learn more.
Here at Headspace and Timing, we'll be joining Give an Hour during that week. The podcast episode that week will be with Dr. Van Dalen, and that week's blog post is going to focus on the Campaign to Change Direction. Longtime listeners will know that our mission is to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health, and the Campaign to Change Direction is doing exactly that. Make sure to check them out at changedirection.org. Welcome to the Headspace and Timing podcast, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes around veteran mental health. My name is Dwayne France, and I'm a retired Army non-commissioned officer and a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After retiring from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, then you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set correctly, however, it was just a useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support service members, veterans, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing podcast once again, and as always, we really appreciate you taking the time to listen and learn more about veteran mental health. I'm excited. My guest today, she and I have a lot of the same training as far as some of the suicide prevention and resiliency training that you get from the Army. So I'd like to welcome Kimberly Franco to the show. Kimberly, welcome.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on, Dwayne.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always good to have a conversation with like-minded individuals, veterans, of course, but also somebody as passionate as you are about suicide prevention and resiliency and things like that. But before we get into that, I want to give you an opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
So I was, you said I was a veteran, did 23 years in the Army. All of those were military police, so I did come in contact with a lot of people that called 911 for crises. And in my 22nd year of military, my brother died by suicide. So that's when I kind of really leaned more towards the prevention efforts of suicide. And I requested that the Army let me retire early so that I could pursue full-time suicide prevention. It was a blessing that I was the first person that they signed off to say, yes, we'll let you release you early, because I was prior enlisted, and I owed, in order to retire as an officer, I had to give the Army that 10 years. I didn't have that 10 years in, but they said, hey, because we know what you're going to go do, we'll go ahead and let you get out early and still retire as an officer. So that was a good thing. I walked right into suicide prevention full time. So I work for the Army Reserve component as a program manager. I manage their suicide prevention and their resiliency program. For my command, it's a 2-star general command. And then, in the course of my time working with the Army Reserve, I realized that there was a big gap as far as postvention support. We were good at training, but we don't do the postvention very well. So realizing that gap, I started One Common Bond as a way to reach out to families, military members as well, after they had a loss to suicide. And then we just basically grew, because grief is grief. You go through different phases, regardless of your type of grief. So now we offer it nationwide to any type of grief. We support anyone that needs it. And that's through packages, through training, and also through our website, just giving out information.
Oh, that's really great. So, one common bond is the grief of loss, right? It's this thing that uniquely, bonds all of us together, not just, service members, of course, but civilians as well. We have a lot of mental health professionals that listen to the show, but we also have a number of veterans that listen to the show, and you and I know what postvention is. But maybe if you could explain a little bit about really what we're looking at suicide. Prevention, of course, is, preventing it from happening, intervention, and then postvention. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So, the prevention, we're great on that. We do the training and everything. We have the intervention where we teach you through different methods, such as the assist training or the 4-hour training that's offered through One Common Bond, teaching you how to intervene. And then the postvention is how do you support a person if they've made an attempt, either made an attempt on their life and now they've gone through the process of getting into the hospital. They're seeing clinicians, and how do you reintegrate them back into the home and back into the unit and the military culture? Also, that postvention also could go to the higher level where if it's a soldier that dies by suicide, how are you going to support the family, the military members as they're also going through grief? Because, we're connected. I think I'm closer to my military family than I am to my own blood because of those bonds that we share through our combat arms. So with that, you have soldiers there that are grieving the loss of one of their battle buddies, and they can't just go do business as usual. So we need to make sure that we're focused on how do we handle the postvention after the suicide. How are we going to help them through the grief process so that they can become whole again and be able to be, effective soldiers in the unit.
Right. And a lot of times that postvention is critical. And many people have heard of, suicide clusters or the contagion effect where, one suicide and then maybe 2 or 3 happen very frequently. And postvention efforts are critical to keeping that from happening. If one service member, say a respected squad leader, takes their own life, and then, the other soldiers are looking and say, well, if he or she couldn't handle it, how could I? So that postvention becomes intervention, and it's almost cyclic.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have, it was a big eye opener for me when I first started in this position, where we had basically what you just described, a squad leader that died by suicide. The unit really did poorly on their postvention efforts. And then 30 days later, the young junior soldier that he had taken under his wing also died by suicide. So that was a real eye opener to us to say, hey, what happened here? And then to go down and talk to the leadership and say, hey, what did you do after this first suicide happened? And they really didn't do a good job. They vilified the NCO, said it was a sign of weakness and different things like that. So when you're, as a leader, if that's the message you're putting out, then, that's not what the soldiers need for their grief support. And then like this young soldier that was under his wings, he just looked up to that person as the only positive male role model he had in his life. And he also took his life. So in my command, whenever we have a suicide loss, the first thing I do is I reach out to the commanders and say, hey, I'm here for you. And wherever they are, because I have 31 different states that I cover, but wherever they're located, I fly there, and I'm there to be one of the first voices that those soldiers hear when they come back to their battle assembly, because I do deal with reservists. So I want to make sure that they're doing the right thing after we have a loss.
Right, and this is challenging, especially with the Guard and Reserve and the Air National Guard, is the disjointed sort of connection that they have with each other, right? Obviously an active military unit, whatever branch of service, you have the chaplain there, you have, support, you're able to call everybody and say, get here in 3 hours and have a conversation about this. And it's challenging, especially with how, geographically dispersed that the reserves and the Guard are. I was having a conversation recently with a young service member. He had just gotten to a unit that had redeployed. He was in southeast Kansas, and they have people from 4 different states: Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kansas. And he said that unit endured something like 14 or 15 suicides within the first year that they were back. And even he was lamenting how challenging it is when you're trying to get that information to such a geographically dispersed population.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's one of the things that we're trying to hit in on through One Common Bond. I know I can do it through that venue. The reserve component, they have to rely on basically the civilian sector. So we really need our civilian sector to be well versed on what the military culture is like and the things that reservists deal with. So some of the issues I see is when my soldiers deploy and then they come back, we go through that whole process of your medical, make sure, were you injured? Did anything happen? And, they go through those meetings and briefings. Those soldiers just want to get home. So a lot of times if things happen mentally, they don't always disclose it because they're just like, hey, that's one extra thing that's going to be added to me getting home. So they don't talk about it. Then they get home and they may be, in a celebration at the house and somebody pops open a bottle of champagne and then you got the soldiers just ducking under the table and they don't realize those things that they have. Hey, there's something going on here that's not normal. But after they're out of the military and they're back into their regular jobs, they don't really want to go back and say, hey, these are the things I'm experiencing. And it's not really open to them to say, hey, these are things I'm experiencing. So we do see a lot of reservists that will just deal with those issues on their own, start self-medicating, usually through drugs or alcohol, or other risky type activities. And then they downward spiral to the point of, where they're in my lane and I'm receiving reports of suicidal ideations or gestures.
And I think that's a great example of you as a suicide prevention coordinator expert, me as a clinician. We're not usually going to come into contact with the person in crisis on the first stage, right? Whereas, as you said, they spiral down and then they get to you, or they engage in a crisis. I often say that if I was a doctor, I'd be an emergency room doctor, right? And it's always either imminently crisis, during crisis or afterwards. You and I are both, applied suicide intervention skills training instructors. And that is a gatekeeper, training, that's aimed to support those individuals who are most likely to come in contact, police officers, family members, clergy, employers, and things like that.
Yeah. So that's what I love, is that we do get to train those gatekeepers, and especially for reserve component, it's even more vital that we have as many trained as possible. Part of what I like to do as an additional thing whenever I teach a class is to get them into the habit of looking up local resources. It's good to have the 1-800 numbers. We have the crisis hotline number they can call, but we want them to start looking up things that address the main issues that we have. So the key factors that we're seeing are relationship issues and financial issues. So I tell them, hey, look in your city or the city where your soldiers live and find out who offers, financial counseling. Find out who gives relationship counseling or that does counseling for stressful type situations, because they don't have the luxury of Fort, that place, the Bennings, the Braggs, the Hoods. They don't have that. They're in the middle of Temecula, California, without anybody around except for maybe the VA hospital. And what most people don't realize with the reserve component is they don't always qualify if they haven't had combat time or a certain number of active duty time. So they're really relying on the civilian sector to get their counseling and their treatment, and they may or may not have medical coverage to be able to pay for that. So that's a big issue that we see within the reserve component, is they don't have the coverage. A big issue I see with the active duty is that, yes, they have the coverage, but they have that stigma behind seeking care. And a lot of them just want to be that, macho infantry. I've got my badges and stuff, and they don't want to go get care because it's seen as a sign of weakness to them. It's a good thing that now we're seeing that the culture is changing, and there's been a shift where you have a lot of high-ranking folks that are coming out and saying, hey, look, I'm in care right now, or hey, I suffer from depression. And it's okay to get care. So they're doing more to help our soldiers out to get what they need so that they don't have that stigma around going out and seeking care.
I appreciate that identification of a couple of different gaps, and especially with the reserve and the guard component, they're not small gaps. They're the kind of gaps that you can drive a semi truck through, right? And again, this misunderstanding of, well, they're a veteran and they can get taken care of, and also to the idea of, well, of course, it's just combat. If you haven't been to combat, then you don't have these struggles. And so it's really as much of a community awareness campaign as it is really trying to connect with the service members themselves.
Right. And what I try to tell people, when we cover suicide deaths on a calendar year. So all of 2018, we had 47 deaths in the reserve component. When you look at those numbers, less than 50% of those that died by suicide had any combat experience at all. So the people that are coming, a lot of soldiers are coming in the Army with PTSD already because of, the things that they've had to endure in their childhood and their upbringing. So we can't always equate PTSD to combat, because it doesn't equate when you're looking at our suicide deaths and the people that are actually taking their lives. So it's important that we just build those resilience skills, because we don't know what people come to the table. When they sign up, we don't know what they're bringing with them.
Right. And that's, I often say is that, you bring the baggage that you had when you came in the military, as much a running away from something as a running to something, and doing something with your life. And then the military often exacerbates that. It just kind of, amplifies that. And if you were depressed as a kid, then it becomes, even more significant, when you're in the military, just because of the stressful occupation and things like that. And then also you said really trying to focus at the local level. A colleague of mine says the suicide epidemic, which is nationwide and not just, veterans, but it's a national problem, but it has to have a local solution, right? You cover a large portion of the United States. And that, that service member is going to be more effectively served by those people in their community, because that's where they live and that's where they're at.
Absolutely. And not only in their community, but in their homes. So there's nothing that breaks my heart more than when I see a suicide report after the fact that has a family member that says, I knew there was things going on wrong, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to call. I didn't know where to take him, or I thought it was going to destroy his or her career if they seek help. So those are the things that we're trying to get at, but it's very difficult to get to family members because they don't always have time to come to our meetings or to come to the training. And a lot of the families, they're not as active in the, within the military culture. So to try to get at within the home and then take that to the neighborhoods and then take that to the community is what I've done through One Common Bond with the 4R training. So that's our version of an advanced suicide training to teach you the steps of suicide, the asking the question and going through that whole process. But we spend a lot of time in the reinforcements and the resources section, which is resources is finding out who's in your local community, find out who gives care. And the big thing is if there's a cost contributed to it, because a lot of times if there's a cost, you're just adding even more to their issues. So I tell them to just look in your communities within churches or through Give an Hour, different resources that can give you care where you don't have to pay for it. And Military One Source is one of those resources that I think a lot of people just say, oh yeah, everybody tells me to call Military One Source, but they really have a lot of information. They can put you in connect with counselors that are in your local community, in your county, your city, your state, free of charge. So a lot of people just really forget what's already out there available to the military. But I think now the military is at a point where they have enough military type treatment, our hospitals and things like that. But they've also augmented that with the civilian sector and other resources to get help where it's confidential. Because I think that's a big thing is people want to talk to somebody that's confidential and are not going to go back and tell their commander, hey, this is what's going on with Sergeant so-and-so. They just want that confidentiality and they want to get the help.
Right. And this is something that many veterans and even those of us like you and I that are serving veterans in the support space, when we hear somebody say, well, we didn't know where to turn or we didn't know what to do or we couldn't find anything, it's almost mind boggling because of the sheer number of resources that are out there. And so, where I've tried to come, and it sounds like what you're trying to do with One Common Bond is really shape the conversation and change the way that people are thinking and talking about this. You mentioned earlier about the stigma, active duty, and of course a lot of reserves as well. People like us don't do things like that, like go to mental health, and there's just this belief that we have. How do we change that conversation?
Yeah, it's about getting the right people into the conversation. So when you have your high-ranking people that are coming up and sharing, they're being transparent with issues that they've had. And they're also open to saying, hey, look, this doesn't make you weak, because I have one lady that she's a widow. She comes forward and she talks about the stigma her husband received when he was in and trying to get care. So having her voice talk about the way her family is dealing with that now has been such a large impact for me, talking to leaders, even to the new privates that come in. Because when they hear her voice and she says she has 3 little kids that won't know their father, I think it's important that we keep people into the space, you know, that when soldiers, when new events happen and they see somebody, like when in the military we had a couple of 2-star or 3-star that died by suicide. And that really opens up the dialogue where people really realize, hey, this is a bigger problem than we really knew. But with introducing all of those confidential resources, I think people are finally realizing that, hey, I need to get the help, and getting help is what's most important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We actually had Brigadier General Don Bolduc on the show. He was the former Special Operations Command Africa commanding general, who very clearly said, you know, me and my senior NCO in my command had to stand up and say, look, this is what you need to do, and this is something that, yes, it's sometimes effective, or it is often very effective when the senior leadership comes up. But even as you said, talking to the young privates, and really it's those mid-level NCOs, I can see, you know, a reservist coming back from demobilization or an active duty service member going through, you know, post-deployment, and the commander and the first sergeant's walking up and down the hall saying, hey, you need to talk to somebody, you need to talk to somebody. But yet they're sitting next to that NCO that they've spent the last 12 months of their life with, that they're much closer sometimes than with the senior leaders. And that NCO turns to him and say, you better not say anything. It's good for them to say their career is okay. It's easy for them, but it's that first line leader that's often blocking, even themselves, their peers, but definitely their subordinates.
Yeah. I think a lot of times, you know, when you go to, for those that go to combat, you go down there, and when you're in that space, you have your brothers and sisters in arms. They're right there near you, and you guys kind of all experience the same thing. So let's say, you know, there's injury, somebody dies by an IED attack or something like that, that if you're closer to that soldier, then you're going to deal with it differently than those who weren't. So the issue is that you cannot try to equate your level of grief with someone else's. And we all go through grief differently, and what we all have different levels of resilience as well. So even though, like when I was in Desert Storm, I saw pits with hundreds of bodies in them that we had to bury, and just for our sanitary reasons where we were located, we had to do that, and we didn't have time to really process what we just saw. It was like, we need to do this as part of our mission and go on with it. And now some of my battle buddies that I was with, they saw that, and that just did something in their brain where they weren't able to function, and we had to send a couple of folks home. I was able to go through and finish up our tour, and I was perfectly fine. So not everyone goes through the experiences the same. So I like the process when you make every single person, you go through those stops and you talk to people. Everyone will talk to a chaplain, and everyone will talk to a counselor, and there's nobody that's exempt from that. That way you don't feel like, okay, he's the person that's going to get help, so he must be the weak link. If everybody has to go through that process, which is what the military is doing now, when they return from deployments, it makes it like in a level playing field, so you don't feel that shame of reaching out and getting help.
That's absolutely true. I recall coming back from Iraq, my first Iraq tour in 2007 was very different than coming back from my Afghanistan tour in 2010, right? You know, it was, again, it was very common for people. And even as you said, senior NCOs or senior leaders now, you know, they were junior enlisted in 2001, right? Of course, we're coming up on, 19 years, of course, of this conflict. And so, an entire generations of service members, majority of them know nothing but a wartime military. And so it's one of these things of trying to understand that your experience is unique to you and your experience isn't common to everybody. But one of the challenges that I see, especially in military transition, and you transitioned out of the military yourself, fairly recently. I got out in 2014. We're not doing that on transition. We're not addressing the mental health and wellness of service members through the transition process. And you know as well as I do, just changing from one culture to another can be challenging. And what we're doing in post-deployment, we're not doing for the military transition.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a huge gap that we see. And even we retired, so that's one level of transition. But you have a lot of people with the military, that active duty, that transition into reserve component because they still want to be in the military and they think, oh, I'll go do the reserves. It's going to be easy. And then they get there and realize, what? I don't have medical. I don't have a meal card. I don't have, the benefits just really shrink down to minimal for what you receive in active duty. So even that transition is drastic. So teaching them how to be civilians, teaching them how to be embraced into that civilian culture. What do you say? Like we don't go to, most people don't call it the latrine or different things that we say in the military. The terms, I'm still, good thing I work with the military because I can still use those terms. But, when you're in a civilian, strictly civilian audience, they don't understand what you're talking about half of the time. So it really is a culture shock. So it does take a bit of transition. And that's why I like having those different agencies out there to kind of keep you connected. Like the Team Red, White, and Blue, they have the events if you want to stay physically active or go do something. But we really encourage people to get connected with other people that have like minds so that you can still have that sense of camaraderie. Because I think that's one of the biggest things that soldiers miss is that camaraderie that you build with the military that really I haven't found any place out that can compare to what we have in the military.
And then you run into a rather unique challenge again, as far as reservists is, yes, in Colorado along the Front Range, there's lots of different organizations to connect with. But again, going back to the young soldier that I talked to, National Guard in Southern Kansas, he said, we don't have any of that. There is no Wounded Warrior. He said the only Wounded Warrior program is when they come and they bring people to our place to hunt. It's not like we actually have, organizations in rural California or, Montana or things like that and so there's just geographically isolating, but also, military culturally isolating.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have, certain pockets of my soldiers that are in different areas. For some reason up in, I do a map of all the issues that the, incidents that come in. So if we have a report of a ideation or a gesture or a death, I just put a little spot on a map. Some areas we'll see big clusters where there's lots of incidents, and then I'll reach out and try to find out what's in that community to cover them. And there's really nothing there. Like in our Ohio and Pennsylvania units that are there, they really don't have a large support. Whereas our folks in North Carolina, of course, they have a wealth of supporters and military activities to be engaged in. So I think it's very important that each community at both the community, city, and state level have active VA departments. They have active ways for soldiers to stay engaged. And a lot of my peers that got out and were kind of missing something, they just went out and they started something. So I always encourage people, hey, if you haven't found what you're looking for, maybe you need to be the one to start it. Maybe you need to be the one to spearhead it and do it, because if you're feeling that way, other people in your community are probably feeling the same way. So it's important that we stay connected with our military brothers and sisters.
I think that's a great point. A colleague of mine, Eddie Lazary, he got out right after 2005. Early on, he did one combat tour, and then he went home to New Hampshire. And he was like, there was nothing here. He was like, and even he, in many ways, very deliberately denied his veteranness, and dove back into, non-veteran culture. And he realized for a very long time that that's what he was missing. I really like that, the idea of looking around and seeing what's there, because that's a critical step. Because again, to be honest, here in Colorado Springs, everybody is building something and we're duplicating efforts like crazy. But if you go 90 miles away, they have zero, right? So it's either an embarrassment of riches or a total gap in services. So this idea of look around and see what's there. If something's there, jump in and lend a hand. If nothing's there, then build it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. We see that a lot here at Fort Bragg. because sure. It's actually the meeting I had just prior to you was talking to another gentleman who does various things for the veterans, and everything he said, I was like, we have that. I'm like, okay, that's great. It's another person doing duplicate work, but that's okay because, it's not a one size fits all for everything. But I do think it's important to know what's available out there because not everybody, we don't necessarily need everybody to be trainers, or we don't need everybody that's doing housing. There's so many things. Just when we identify gaps, that's where you make the most impact. So that's really and it's everything I do is military. The stuff that I did when I was working in the op shop and my colonel was telling me, you do this, do that, do this. And I'm like, okay. And all that analysis and stuff I hated doing, I do it now still in my civilian work and in my nonprofit because it works. It's there for a reason. You identify what gaps you have, and then you see if you can fill those gaps so that we can, support the whole. So those military skills are still at work, and they will be forever.
Now, I'm curious to hear how the work that you're doing is received among other veteran organizations. Sometimes one thing that I've experienced, especially if this, a large number of resources that are available, sometimes people can believe that their solution is the solution, and all the veteran needs is whatever I do. That there's not a lot of collaboration. How have you seen your discussion about mental health, wellness, resiliency, suicide prevention teamed up with other organizations in your area or even nationally that are addressing other veteran needs?
Yeah. So with me, I'm a big believer in having collaboration and bringing together communities. So within Fayetteville, the other agencies that are here, they've embraced me. It's not a competitive type culture or anything like that. We just, see what the need is. I know that within here, there are other people that are training classes, but I also know that there's nobody else that are doing certain things that I identified with the reserve component specifically. And, just being able to get out there and partner with them helps out a lot. I do an event once a year called Connect North Carolina. This year, it's actually going to be in Fayetteville, where we bring together agencies that help promote health and wellness. So we bring you in if you're somebody that helps with the physical, the spiritual, emotional, or social aspect of life in general. We want you to come together, and we have what starts out with an expo time where all these agencies come into the room. They set up their tables and they talk about what they do, what they provide to veterans and to the community. And not only, the good thing about it this year is, we're compartmentalized here. So you have, if you've ever been to Fort Bragg, it's maybe 4 little cities, and they all have their own little mayor and their own thing. And each of those cities they're doing their own thing. So what I tell, like the meeting I just went to today is he's like, hey, we need to do a suicide prevention whatever thing. And I was like, oh, that's great. When are you trying to do it? Well, he's doing it the exact same time I'm doing mine. And I was like, how about we come together, we all get our schedules out and find out what we're doing. So we're not doing a million suicide prevention things in 1 week when we can spread things out throughout the course of the year, but they're good about that. We're, in these events, when we do them, our participants are large. They're very diverse. And then when they come into the room, they're learning, oh, this lady has this one common bond. They can help me after, like with grief. But over here, you have these folks that can help me with support groups, because I don't necessarily do support groups, but I can connect you to support groups. And then you have this group over here that is their counselors. So they're trying to get you before that time. So we bring everybody in there to kind of help build you up with that resilience so that it doesn't get to the point of suicide. But if it does, that's where I step in, and I'm there to support for after the post-vention portion.
See, and that's great. Definitely the idea of collaboration, not competition, because no one organization can do all of this, because that is the VA, right? And even the VA recognizes its own limitations. And like you said, and I am, to be honest, familiar with Fayetteville. I served 3 years in the 82nd back in the late 90s. And so even Fort Bragg itself, or even pockets of Fort Bragg, are insular and don't really communicate either with different units and other sides of the post. but then there's something else beyond just the collaboration in high resource rich areas. That's where you're starting to do. You had mentioned before we started talking about online training to reach those individuals that does not have these resources, right? The Central Mountain regions in Colorado, or, there's a lot of resources in North Carolina if you're close to the coast, but if you're up in Asheville in the mountains, there's likely less, right? And so, one common bond is starting some online training, you said, coming up here pretty quick, to be able to reach some of those.
Absolutely. That's something that's really been, my main focus for the past couple of years now, realizing that we can't get to our remote soldiers even. And it's very costly when we have to reserve component. When we do classes, we bring you into a location, we train you for 2 days, and then we send you home. Each one of those classes is about $25,000. So when you look at our economy and how we're scaling down on lots of things, that's something that they're looking at saying, hey, is there a way for you guys to do this without flying people into these locations for 2 days and then flying them home? So that's where I know the Army does not want to do an online training. I've been trying to push the idea for several years now, and I keep getting shut down. So I said, well, I know I have another route. So that's what the One Common Bond is doing, where we have the 4R training. It's an advanced suicide intervention training to teach you the skills to do that intervention. Also teaches you how to do those research on resources. And that's something that I wanted to push out to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to get it. Specifically those family members. If you're in a home and you see and identify that there's something wrong, I want you to have the skills to know what to do. And that's what the whole point of this, the training is. And it's not a very, very long course. When I teach this in the classroom setting, it's a 4-hour training. So it's compact. You do a lot of role play, a lot of video vignettes that you have to work through. But it's a good course, and I tailor it. I've done different ones for different audiences up to 8 hours. So basically we're taking that 8-hour course, streamlining it down to where you can go online and take it at your own time, at your own pace. It's a modular based training, and you can go ahead and do that without having to worry about, childcare or getting time off of work. You can take it, in the comfort of your home whenever it's most convenient to you.
It's interesting that you say the military is going away from or resistant to online training, right? And I imagine some of that is just the culture of you don't have that senior NCO walking around making sure that Joe ain't sleeping, right? And go stand up against the wall. I mean, and not being able to sign in. And so there's this level of accountability. That's sort of my first take. Why do you think the military is resistant to that type of delivery of this information?
I think specifically for suicide prevention is that they don't want someone to be in a crisis at that moment and not have somebody that can support them. So like with this class, what we do is the very first module says, here's the number to the crisis hotline. Here's the number these are the steps to take if you're going through crisis as you go through this course, so that we put that disclaimer out there right early with links that people can click on, so that if they're feeling distressed or they're feeling a certain way, they can go ahead and get the help. In the 5 years I've been teaching suicide prevention constantly, I have had several people in my class that have come up to me and said, hey, you know what? I'm dealing with issues, or hey, I have a family member that's dealing with this type of issue, and I'm always there to support them. But I always tell them, hey, look, if I'm not available, here's numbers too. So even my business card has the crisis hotline on there. So I think that's what they're reluctant to going online. But what I've told my leaders is, hey, we have to get into the culture and the way that they learn now. My 8-year-old kid down the street, he's online training. Our college students right now, they're doing things online. So let's meet them in the way that they're used to learning right now. And that's how they're used to learning, is online with really cool avatars and interaction and things like that. And I think we just need to give it as an option. Maybe not the only way. Sure, let's do the face-to-face thing, but let's make an option out there for those who just can't get to that classroom.
I think that's very critical, and that's a much less cynical reason to avoid it than mine, of course. But this idea of reaching people in the way that they want to hear it and they need to hear it. There was a study that came out the beginning of last year that looked at 4,000 post 9/11 veterans, and over 50% of post 9/11s were comfortable accessing mental health information through technology, whether you have suicide intervention apps or the crisis hotline went to text base and online chat. What we're doing here as far as podcasts and blogs and Psych Armor is significantly supportive of this kind of thing. And so you're right. This idea of it doesn't matter how they get the information. It just matters that they get the information. Absolutely.
Yeah. Those cases that I read of those wives that it just happened to be these ones were all wives that knew their husbands were dealing with issues and they didn't know how to get them help. This could have been a resource that can help, and that's what I'm trying to push towards. Is where I don't want another wife to say I didn't know. So this training is being offered free of charge to any military family member or military affiliated, and there is a cost for civilians that want to take the class, but it's a very minimal cost, $25 to take a really informative online training where there's really not that opportunity out there. So this is why I wanted to push it out to make sure that our military members receive what they need, and it's not just tailored to the military. So there's modules specifically for military. If you're not a military person, you want to take the course, then you can just skip that module and you're still going to get the same effect. But I just wanted to make sure that I reached the target audience that I see has the biggest need. And that's our military family members and our reserve component, National Guard, that don't really get around the military very often.
That's great. And again, yet another way to connect back to that military culture, to get some of that familiarity that many service members feel the lack of whenever they leave. This has been great, Kimberly. I want to give you an opportunity to, if somebody wants to reach out and find you online, One Common Bond, how can they get a hold of you, social media, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So the military, or the One Common Bond is www.1, that's the number 1, commonbond.org. And that's where you can go to find out about our post-vention efforts. You'll see a picture of all of the grief care packages that we send out, because that's one of our large things that we do is we send out a grief care package, which has the leading book on grief, a journal, a pen. We send a condolence card, as well as anything that might be specific to that family. If it's a suicide, we put a booklet in there that talks about suicide. And I'm happy to announce that my mother and I have just finished our own publication to add to those that speaks specific to suicide, because that's a whole nother level of loss. And then not only do we send out that package, another thing that we do is we continue to support that family throughout the year. So as Mother's Day and Father's Day are coming up pretty soon, we send out cards to families that we know that this is their first year of loss. We send cards out on the anniversary date of your loss, just so that somebody's thinking about you, because I think it's important for your grief process to remember that, hey, you're not alone in this. So that's the www.onecommonbond.org. And on that link, it has links to our other, to our training. We have lots of resources for just informative type documents you can download. It also will tell you about our Connect events, which we do here in North Carolina. And those are the events where we bring in those expo tables and have people talk about what services they provide that can help you just have a whole life. All of those links are on our webpage. Our email is the same number 1, commonbond@gmail.com. That's the number 1, commonbond altogether @gmail.com.
Okay, I'll make sure that all of those are in the show notes and that people will be able to access those. Any last thoughts before we sign off here?
No, I just thank you for the opportunity. The biggest thing with what we do is exposure. So typically what happens is we hold an event or we do something, and then maybe about a month later, somebody will say, hey, I need to order one of those packages because I just had a friend that died. And it's not just suicide. It can be cancer. It can be, anything that someone passes away. It's a grief care product because we want to make sure that as you go on your grief journey, you're not alone. That's the motto of One Common Bond.
That's great, Kimberly. I really appreciate, and not just coming on the show today, but for the work that you're doing. It's outstanding.
Thank you. Happy to do it.
You're listening to Headspace and Timing, where we're trying to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health. As you can tell by this episode, you don't have to be a mental health professional to do something about veteran mental health. Kimberly found it her calling, of course, after losing her brother and seeing it impact so many service members. You don't need a degree to do something, you just need to be educated and get the skills necessary to intervene. One point that I'd like to bring out from this episode, Kimberly and I talked about the duplication of services. She brought up a good point. Not everyone is going to need the same thing or get it from the same organization. If an agency is providing the same service for the same population in the same area, that's a problem. It is better that they collaborate and cooperate rather than exist in competition. If an agency is providing the same service for a different population, however, that's okay. I recently had the privilege of spending some time with the Marine Recon and Sniper Foundation. A similar organization, the EOD Warrior Foundation, is providing support for former explosive ordnance disposal team members. Both of them are providing a similar service, but for different populations. A Recon Marine may be hesitant to reach out for help to anyone but another Recon Marine, and a former EOD troop may not reach out to anyone other than another EOD team member. Similarly, providing different services to the same population, such as the differentiation between the Travis Manion Foundation, which is helping veterans find meaning and purpose through youth education, and the Mission Continues, which is helping veterans find meaning and purpose through community engagement, is also totally okay. The challenge is when multiple organizations are trying to solve veteran homelessness, for example, in the same location with the same goals. That's when we need to collaborate. I just ask that you consider that as you are working with the resources for service members, veterans, and families in your local area. Thanks for taking the time to check us out. If you want to find the show notes for this episode, go to veteranmentalhealth.com/HST120. Our thanks this month go to Give an Hour and the Campaign to Change Direction. Don't forget, we'll be joining them for the Week to Change Direction from June 9th to June 15th. If you want to see how you can too, go to changedirection.org.
A Week to Change Direction will happen anywhere and everywhere people and organizations want to be part of this change. Give an Hour will provide toolkits with suggestions and ideas for how you or your organization can participate in a Week to Change Direction, or you can create your own.
We're always looking for guests, either veterans or those who support them. You can drop me a line at info@veteranmentalhealth.com to recommend guests, or go to veteranmentalhealth.com/guest to fill out a suggestion or request. I'm happy to announce that I've released a paperback version of the first Headspace and Timing book. It's been available on Kindle for a couple of years, but now you can get it along with Combat Vet Don't Mean Crazy. Check it out. Go to veteranmentalhealth.com/HST book. Just a reminder that the guests and information in this show are for educational purposes only and not meant to be considered professional advice. While I am a practicing therapist, I'm not your therapist. Something you've heard makes you think that you should talk to somebody, then reach out to do so. I'd like to thank Doc Todd for giving us permission to use his track, Not Alone, from his album Combat Medicine. Doc's trying to bring the discussion about veteran mental health out of the darkness, and you can see all of his work at therealdoctodd.com. Make sure to join us for the next episode. Hit subscribe on your podcast player of choice so you don't miss it. Until then, remember, veterans, you're not alone. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-creating enemies. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic Tennessee, embrace my ability.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep staying. How this life so demanding, so much pain on this planet. I heard each time my way, but with you I'm not alone.
You're not alone.
Yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every med that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.